So tonight we're talking about the role of trauma when we're feeling stuck. I thought this picture of the elephant stuck in mud with people attempting to help was a really good analogy for the way some of us feel sometimes. And, when we're stuck, we just often struggle initially a little bit when we feel it coming on, or as we're aware that our forward momentum is shifting. But generally, the feeling of being stuck um, engages thoughts of helplessness, hopelessness. We feel isolated. We often look around to see if we're the only one that is experiencing this um, feeling of stuckness and inertia. And so we're comparing and contrasting our situation with others. And it's often low level fear that both fuels and also is the result of inactivity and being in a stuck place. So, what stuck looks like. Um, this is some of our coping strategies with being stuck. We feel, I'm afraid, therefore I avoid. And when we avoid, that often means moving away from the direction that we were previously headed. And so everything sort of stops and changes direction. Avoidance also means that we are not engaging what our purpose or intention is all about, and instead we're moving off in a different direction or not moving at all. In For tonight's purposes, when we're talking about what stuck looks like, avoidance usually results in inertia. We often pretend. I will talk to people and say, how are you doing? And I get a whole list of how everything is going well. And if I don't ask any more probing questions, I can often be left with the impression that everything is good. And then later, when I find out that everything is not good, that this person was feeling shame or fear, and therefore pretending, I have initially sort of a feeling of betrayal, but then that is quickly followed, after years of working in this business, quickly followed by empathy and compassion and a sense of understanding that sometimes when you're afraid, in the absence of knowing what to do or how to fix the problem, we pretend. We backslide into old patterns that feel like we're entering sort of ancient history. We distract ourselves and find reasons to take on projects or say yes and commit ourselves to something that leaves us no time and energy to really move forward, and therefore we get stuck in our avoidance. We make excuses. We abandon ourselves or our plan. And sometimes we start lots of little projects which we never finish. So what being stuck looks like is, I'm afraid, therefore I avoid, I pretend, I backslide into old patterns, I distract myself, I make excuses, I abandon myself or my plan, and I tend to start lots of projects that I never finish. So what is the fear? I thought this little minion here really shows us what often is the case. I think I'm afraid to be happy because whenever I get too happy, something bad always happens. If I were to ask for a show of hands right now, I would bet that most everyone listening to the sound of my voice has had this feeling. Being afraid to be happy, because whenever you get too happy, something bad happens. That's absolutely evidence of past trauma. Because for those people who haven't experienced trauma, they're not afraid to be happy. They're not afraid that the rug is going to be pulled out from underneath them. So when we're afraid and we don't feel confident anymore, we often feel confused. Sometimes confusion is actually an adaptive coping strategy so that we can avoid moving forward. I have lots of conversations with people, and I'm sure you've experienced this with patients, where you ask them questions like, how's the pain in that left elbow? Well, I'm not sure. I actually have been feeling a little low back pain, and I'm really fatigued, and I'm a little concerned about what's going to happen at my work. And so there's all this distractibility and confusion around a simple question that you asked, which is, how's your elbow? How's the pain in your elbow? And so when you're lacking confidence and you notice that confusion has taken residence in your mind and in your language, that's a time to ask for help, because what you want to replace the confusion with is clarity. Clarity will help you get back into the groove again and find your momentum. Clarity will help you avoid feeling stuck and inertia. I'm not confident anymore because I'm insecure and unsure of myself. I'm not confident because old shame keeps coming up. I feel like an imposter. I believe I'm broken. I've lost my motivation. I'm afraid I'll embarrass myself. And that last one is really a big one. Because when we're lacking confidence, even though we may have taken big steps, big risks for us to move forward in life, sometimes that fear of being too happy because it'll be taken away really works hand in glove with the idea that you'll embarrass yourself, that somehow you'll be humiliated because you won't really be successful and everyone can see it and everyone will know it except maybe you. So the fear that is the petri dish, that lack of confidence is born from, includes all these flawed statements, all these distortions in the way that we experience ourselves. So when you're feeling confused, you want to choose clarity. When you're insecure and unsure, you need encouragement and validation. When you're feeling ashamed, notice what old stories you're telling yourself. When you feel like an imposter, remind yourself about your competence and the expertise that you have. When you believe that you're broken or you start to go to that place again, remember that broken bones heal, broken hearts mend, that just because you've been broken does not mean you aren't healed. Brokenness does not mean that you're flawed beyond any hope of achieving success or happiness. It just means that you've been hurt in life, and that that brokenness can always expand into healing and into a state of encompassing others and inspiring others and yourself. Losing your motivation, often as a result of a lack of confidence and that fear of embarrassment we've already talked about. So losing momentum, how does this happen? Some of that is that we move into a place of feeling re-traumatized. When you talk to hospice people, they often talk in terms of grief. and they will share that every loss brings up all the previous losses. That doesn't mean that you have to stay in that state, but that's just the human condition. So when we lose momentum, when we're feeling stuck, when we're lacking confidence, we often return to the traumatization that we've experienced in the past, and we can feel re-traumatized in that moment. So I feel re-traumatized when I listen to the wrong people. When you invite people to share with you who are negative or destructive or don't really understand who you are, what you've been through, and where you're going, you can begin to feel re-traumatized, because often in the midst of our traumatization, there are people who are oblivious, there are people who don't listen, there are people who tell us that pink is green, even when we know that it's pink, they keep telling us it's green. And so we have experienced that when we listen to the wrong people, pain and injury isn't too far off. We can feel re-traumatized when we berate ourselves and start indulging negative self-talk. And I use the term indulging here because, you know, I really do think that there is a point when we're horribly depressed or anxious where negative self-talk can feel intrusive and like it's really not so much of a choice. But if we are very present with ourselves and begin to notice how we are feeling, and compare and contrast what we're feeling with what we're doing and what our behaviors are, we can slow everything down and not indulge the negative self-talk. We can notice when we begin to berate ourselves and instead choose positive messages, stop the negative soundtrack, and start to choose the positive instead. When we lose momentum, we forget to inspire ourselves and fill ourselves up. It's absolutely critical that we inspire ourselves and fill ourselves up every single day. And I'm telling you that I am someone who sometimes in my desire to really achieve, I'm creating a lot of content, I'm talking to a lot of people, I enjoy my work, I can forget to inspire myself and fill myself up, and there's always a price to pay. And for me, it usually shows up as feeling a little off, a little more vulnerable than usual. I start to maybe feel a little bit sorry for myself for some reason. Those are clues for me that I've probably forgotten to fill myself up. And now the results of that are that I'm beginning to experience depletion. Another way we re-traumatize ourselves is by minimizing our progress or successes. You know, we can often sort of dismiss that minimization and say, well, you know, I don't want to be egotistical, I want to be realistic, and we find ways to reframe it so that we're sort of the hero. But when you minimize your progress and success, I'm going to make a statement here that may be a little jolting, but when you do that, you are not living in the truth. You are choosing instead to live in a lie. So I really, really want you to hear me on this one, because when we feel re-traumatized and we're minimizing our progress and successes, we're not being truth tellers, and instead we're choosing that which is false. So when you notice that you're minimizing, say, oh, wait a minute, I want to be honest here. And the honest truth is, I am actually experiencing some success. I've had some micro success. I've had some pretty big victories. And so even though right now I'm feeling a little stuck, I don't want to succumb to a lack of honesty or living in a lie. The other thing that happens when we feel re-traumatized is we compare ourselves to everyone else or some false ideal. for those who are listening who had trauma in their childhoods, we very much looked around as children who were experiencing trauma to try and figure out, was anyone else noticing? Were other people's lives the way ours were? So we're comparing ourselves to them and saying, well, they seem like they're fine. And so maybe it's just me. And so whenever we start to compare ourselves to others and try to make ourselves wrong in it, because it's too painful to acknowledge that there are those around us who are asleep, unconscious, or just choose not to acknowledge the truth, we can feel re-traumatized. So I think these 5 re-traumatization, losing momentum characteristics in our lives are very important. And so after the slideshow here, you might want to write these things down and go through the slideshow so that you can be reminded about what the triggers are for re-traumatization, which fuels a loss of momentum and takes you to a place of feeling stuck. So when we tune into the wrong crowd, we often ask to be validated with the wrong crowd. You know, that very first statement, we turn to the wrong people because we want to be okay. So we say, please validate me. I want to be okay. And if we're talking to the wrong person, we're not going to get that. In fact, we'll get just the opposite. And so we'll feel invalidated and less than okay. We'll feel wrong. When we tune into the wrong crowd, we're really asking and needing to be encouraged because we feel discouraged. We're not trusting ourselves, so we're giving our power away and putting our faith in someone else. And that's a dangerous thing to do when we're tuning into the wrong crowd. We need approval, and so we start asking permission from people who haven't had the courage we've had, or who don't understand who we are, or who have ulterior motives or other agendas. We tune into the wrong crowd in asking for support because we're afraid of mistakes and feel like they're going to keep us on the straight and narrow, and we have to be perfect here. So these are impulses that we have within ourselves where we need validation, we need encouragement, we need to feel like we can trust in something, we need approval, and we're wanting to make sure that we're doing a good job and that we're not making mistakes. And if we tune into the wrong crowd to ask for validation, encouragement, faith, approval, and belief in ourselves, we will be very sadly disappointed. So this little cartoon here shows a bunch of lemmings saying, I don't know where we're going, but from the look of this crowd, it's got to be good. And of course, they're all jumping off the cliff. How many people in medicine can really relate to this? So it's very, very important that if you find you're not getting validation, encouragement, faith, approval, help with seeing what you're doing right rather than what you're doing wrong, then you're tuning into the wrong crowd, and you need to choose the people that you confide in, or that you use as mentors, or that you talk to. You need to change who you do that with. So the inner critic. We indulge the inner critic because we have the false belief somehow that it keeps us in line. When we have been in situations where there's high levels of stress and we're constantly cheerleading and talking to ourselves and telling ourselves, you can do it, don't be a jerk, don't make a mistake, come on, push through. And the inner critic is just goading us. Sometimes we can develop the false belief that somehow that inner critic keeps us in line. We begin to minimize how much damage the inner critic does and how abusive that inner critic can be. And instead, we start sort of lauding the inner critic and saying, well, at least it keeps me in line. We indulge the inner critic because we feel a sense of shame, because it's a habit or voice that is familiar, um, because we're afraid of making mistakes and we believe that the inner critic somehow has wisdom that we don't and will help us avoid mistakes. But actually, often the inner critic stresses us out so much and distorts the truth that we are more likely to make mistakes when we listen to the inner critic, because the inner critic will say, push through, push through, push through, forget your needs, do what is expected of you. And it's at our expense and often is very destructive. We listen to the inner critic because it's the only voice we know. And often it mirrors voices from our past. I talked to a physician the other day who was incredibly stressed. And he was talking about, this inner voice, the inner dialogue, the inner narrative. And I said, so who does that voice sound like? And of course, I was thinking that maybe this was someone from childhood. And he said, well, actually, now that you ask me that, it's a woman's voice. And it was someone who I received training from who was hypercritical, hyper perfectionistic, had, unbelievable standards, and taught us through the use of fear. But it's a voice that I've come to believe that kept me safe when I was going through training and fellowship. And so we really had to work with that a little bit to discern whether this voice really was keeping him safe, because he was working so hard and overextending so much that he was really putting his health at risk. Wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating well, all those things. So that's really important. Another reason we indulge the inner critic is because we tell ourselves it keeps us humble. I don't want to be arrogant. And so, I think it's good to listen to that critical voice. And I would just call bullshit, because humility is not born from listening to an inner critic. Humility is really born from having uber confidence. And when you're very, very confident, you aren't attached to your ego, and therefore you can embrace humility very readily. The inner critic does not create humility, it creates humiliation and shame. There's a difference between humility and humiliation. So fill me up. We need to ask for what we need, be honest. Assert ourselves. Identify what we most want and go for it. Keep track of what we're putting out versus what is coming in. If we're giving more than we're getting, then we're going to be depleted. It's always better to have some reserves to really fill yourself up so that you're able to give without constantly being afraid that you're going to overextend. Treat yourself generously. I was going to put extravagantly, but I thought maybe some people would get hung up on that word. So treat yourself generously. If you had a friend coming to visit who was burned out, overwhelmed, you would treat them with generosity. So you deserve that. If your friend deserves it, you certainly deserve it. Do not withhold from yourself. Indulge yourself versus withholding from yourself. Because if you fill yourself up, you will have enough fuel to be able to move forward again and have some momentum. If you have no gas in the car, as much as you want to go on a road trip, it's never going to happen. You have to ask for what you need, be honest, be assertive, identify what you want most and go for it. Keep track of what you're putting out versus what's coming in. Treat yourself with generosity and indulge yourself rather than withholding. This is a distortion-free zone. which means beware the tendency to minimize what you're doing. Um, so many people talk um, in denigrating terms about themselves. I'm such an idiot. I'm so stupid. I had a call today where the first thing the person said is, I want to tell you about something that I did that was stupid. Um, that's a distortion. Now, somebody can start the conversation by saying, I want to share with you something that I feel I did that was a mistake, because we all make mistakes. But really beware minimizing either what's going really well or what's not going really well. Sometimes we feel pressure to keep up with everyone else and somehow act like everything is fine. And we minimize the stress we're going through, the challenges we're having, and that's a distortion. So a distortion-free zone helps get you back on track toward momentum building versus inertia. Keep track of only what goes wrong, and you are distorting the truth. Because it's not just what's going wrong in your life, it's what's going right. And it doesn't matter how challenging your life is right now, there is something that's going right. And so if all you're doing is minimizing the successes or minimizing the challenges, you're keeping track only of what goes wrong and not what goes right, you're distorting the truth of your situation, and you're more likely to then engage confusion. One of the things that fuels distortion is changing the standards by which we measure our success. I have had so many conversations with people that give me a very clear idea of what success means to them. And they can tell me what their clinic will look like in order to be successful, what their personal life needs to look like, what they need to make in terms of money. And then when we have a really honest conversation and they say, well, I'm still not successful. And I start listing all the standards that, their key performance indicators that would indicate success, and they're meeting all of them. And then they say, well, it's really not about the money. And well, it's, yes, I have a full practice, but I'm not sure they're really my ideal patients. And so when you change the standard by which you measure success, it creates confusion in your psyche, and it creates incongruency. So that part of ourselves that's highly motivated, and everyone listening to the sound of my voice has, gotten to where you are today by being, highly motivated, academically focused, really sort of probably a type A or at least a go-getter. And when you are working to achieve something and then you achieve it and it's never good enough because you've changed the standard by which you measure success, then you're distorting what the truth is. And when we live in distortion, the natural human tendency is to give up. If the rat in the maze knows that every time they go a certain way that there's going to be a food pellet, but we start to change the outcome so that they go the same way they've always gone, and only this time there's no food, and they have to do something else in order to get food, it creates confusion. And so that's something to be very careful about. We're at risk of distorting when we start comparing ourselves to others. Well, I know I'm an OBGYN and that's a very different practice than a radiology practice, but still, I should be as successful as the radiologist sitting across the table from me. It sounds ridiculous as you hear me saying that, but it's really shocking how many times we do something very, very similar, where we compare ourselves to someone where it's not even, on equal footing. There's no real logical reason to compare these two individuals or to compare yourself with this person, and yet you do and find yourself lacking. That's a distortion. It's a lack of truth. We catastrophize. So we imagine all kinds of horrible things happening. And when we do that, sometimes we do that almost from a suspicious place of like, well, you know, maybe if I don't expect too much, I won't be disappointed. And so these people catastrophize and say, well, you know, yes, last month was a good month, but you know, can't count on it this month, and it's January, and Januaries are always slow, and man, if I have a bad January, I'm living paycheck to paycheck, you know, that could be the end. I could close my clinic by February. That's catastrophizing. And some people do it because they're superstitious and feel like catastrophizing wards off something horrible happening, but quite the contrary. If you're living in the negativity and you're constantly anticipating some drama, you likely will begin to attract it in your life. And so when you notice catastrophizing, that's a time to comfort yourself, to get the validation you need, to do some of the things that I talked about earlier in tonight's discussion, where you're reaching out to the right people, not the wrong people, and where you're filling yourself up and making wise choices for yourself. And then really notice success avoidant behaviors. That's where, you know, something isn't broken, and yet you get a bee in your bonnet that you have to fix it. And often that's a saboteur that maybe you're not even conscious of, that is at work because you're afraid to be successful. And so just when you're on the cusp of success, just when you're starting to build momentum, you have success avoidant behaviors that you engage, and it derails you. And it's like, oh, and now, you know, I'm not successful after all. And in fact, you know, I'm really struggling. And that's what I thought. I didn't think I'd be able to be successful. So it validates that inner critic and the part of ourselves that's disbelieving. So really pay attention to when you're minimizing. Be sure to keep track of what goes right as well as what goes wrong. Keep the standards by which you measure success, and only modify those in small ways so that you keep, by and large, the standard, just adding perhaps a few new measures or little measures so that the modification happens slowly and you don't self-destruct. Be careful about comparing yourself to others, catastrophizing, and success avoidant behaviors. So in order to gain momentum, you need to change your story. And so many times, some of the trauma we've had in the past is easily overlaid on something that's happening in our present. And we start to say, yep, you know, that's the way it always happens for me. And so the story remains the same. But if we change our story, we're much more likely to begin gaining momentum and not get stuck. So this sounds redundant, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So don't go to the wrong crowd. Don't group source from the wrong crowd. Ask different people and change the questions when you're needing help and validation. Fuel positive inner dialogue and send your inner critic packing. Spend time every day doing something that feels good. It's always surprising to me when I talk to people who seem to have almost no space for bringing feel-good experiences into their life. You should have feel-good experiences, that's plural, in your life every single day. This is not just something you do on the weekend or once a month, every single day, because those pleasure centers need a workout. They need exercise in order to remember how to flood our system with those good endorphins. And the way to do that is by doing things that feel good. But when you have been so um, conditioned to expect everything to be hard, to expect everything to be a struggle. You know, in medicine, so much of what the language is adversarial. And, you know, we're fighting off that virus. We're, you know, fighting the cancer. We're, you know, struggling to find the right answers. So it really impacts us and changes us. And so, what I'm encouraging you to do is, um, even if it feels uncomfortable, spend time every day doing something that feels good. Eventually, you will come to have some peace around it, just even by virtue of habit. You can't wait until you want to feel like it's okay to do something good. If you do that, you'll be waiting forever. You have to do it even in the absence of feeling comfortable. And eventually, you will begin to feel comfortable with doing something every day that feels good. Keep track of your successes. And finally, identify any obstacles that show up and remove them. And sometimes you can do that on your own, sometimes you need help. But but in order to change your story, you need to ask different people, change the questions, fuel positive dialogue inside yourself. Um, Spend every day doing something that feels good, keep track of success, identify any obstacles and remove them. So as with every evening where we meet as a trauma group, we review the fact that post-traumatic stress shows up in our lives as a flashback or flooding of emotion. We often recognize it and are catapulted into a place of wanting to avoid. If we don't intervene at that juncture, we will then move into a state of arousal and reactivity, which affects our cognition through anxiety, depression, OCD, and then ultimately it affects our mood and we can feel highly depressed, anxious, and sometimes even suicidal. So post-traumatic stress is real, and if you are actively having PTSD in your life, you definitely need help and support to move from that triggered state into a state where you are resourced enough to heal and move forward.